All right, I guess it's time for one of these silly book discussion type things. I don't know why I do them, but people watch them. So this one's The Amazons, Women Warriors in Myth and History by Lynn Webster Wild. Um, so I tend to read a moderate amount of nonfiction type stuff. Not a whole hell of a lot, you know, but I try to fit a little bit in. This is an interesting type. Um, it's not a scholarly book like you would see coming out of a dig or something like that. It's more discussing sort of a personal journey of, I don't even know what she is. She's not an archaeologist. I think she's a journalist, to tell you the truth, who, you know, is just trying to discover the main gist of the story of who the Amazons might have been. Were they real? Stuff like that. And, you know, taking from that kind of point of view, some of it is personal discovery type stuff, you know, and just random crap mixed in that's, you know, of general kind of interest. It makes the story more intriguing, makes you feel somewhat connected to the author, etc. Some of it is driven by, you know, real research in the sense that she's gone and looked up a few, but not like this is a life's work type of thing. A few of the major contributors to various fields in archaeology and history that apply in classics, if you want to throw that in. It's kind of sitting in between. By kind of just sort of scratching the surface of the scholarship, I feel a certain level of, you know, camaraderie, I guess, or empathy with the author in that sense, because there are things that, you know, I'll look at and do about that level of research with. Now, I wouldn't write something based on that, but, you know, I'm also not a professional writer, whether I'm published or not, which is kind of a fuzzy thing. But yeah, I mean, so from the point of view of like what you kind of have is these sort of half-baked hypotheses that the author puts out. Doesn't really try to push them, tries to find supporting evidence for them, finds contradictory evidence and reports on that and everything. So it's all, you know, it's all very honest. You know, you're not going to walk away from this saying, "Oh, this is what it is," and the theory sort of develops as she's doing her research. In addition to that, she also takes a couple of trips, you know, but not the I guess the rationale behind those trips is sort of the, well, I want to see for myself type of thing. But, you know, I don't know how much advantage there really is to an untrained person, you know, listening to an expert and having some things demonstrated to them, or getting their impressions from burial goods and artifacts and whatnot. The published material should be enough to present your case or not. But this isn't really about presenting a case. It's more about this journey of discovery about the Amazons and trying to see, if she can come up with some kind of solution, and she doesn't really, that adequately describes everything. And the answer is probably no, she couldn't. But, there's a narrative that she sort of develops throughout it that is not unbelievable. It has to do with that these stories, like almost anything, they're so prevalent throughout the Mediterranean area, at least, that there has to be, something, right? Something behind them. And that something is in a broad range, ranging between maybe there were a few isolated cases, probably not for any long period of time, of women who had separated themselves from the males in their society and were living completely separate, but more likely it had to do with a less patriarchal society. Whether it's just matrilineal or whether it was actually a matriarchy is up for grabs. Some of the things that are evidential are things like, that the Cretans, for example, were able to, or should we call them Cretans, had a certain amount of feminine participation in the sports arena, in particular with some things like jumping the bulls and whatnot, although they seem to be less common than the males doing so. And that, now this is where I got kind of fuzzy on the whole thing, was sort of and I think her grasp wasn't much better than what mine is going into it. The origin of certain Hittite aspects to this, which is closer to the period that would be described here. Most of the Amazon stories appear to be buried deep in the mists, which means, maybe late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, as opposed to near the period of Bronze Age collapse. And for the Hittites, you're talking about, I think you're talking early, the beginning of the Iron Age in that area. I don't want to commit to that, though. My own knowledge is very shaky in general. But the fuzziness on her side is whether the Hittites were a patriarchal invader who comes in and disrupts this earlier, less gender restrictive civilization that existed there before. And there's clearly evidence that there's the case that there was, with the Great Mother worship and whatnot. There's clearly evidence that things were not as the later Greek period starts to show them, the classical Greek period, as opposed to when you're looking at like the Minoan era and the Trojan War era. She finds fair amounts of evidence, shaky at times, quite often very shaky, that there was still more female participation in either government and decisions or in actual beyond that. Certainly not ruling. You have your male kings and whatnot described quite well there. So, but that really Athens is sort of the pinnacle of the patriarchal repression, and that you look at Sparta, and Sparta is kind of maintains a lot more freedom for the women in the period of the more classical era, and in fact the Athenians are kind of shocked and horrified by just how free the women in Sparta are comparatively. Of course, women in Sparta were probably rarer, and you had the segmentation of the society, which almost invariably is going to give women more power than men. So, the men went off to their military camps at a very young age and trained and whatnot there, and the relationship with the women were almost a segmented set, which in some ways is one of the arguments that she makes, is that you might have a society of that nature where the men were out on raids or fighting for a long time or whatever, and the women became warlike in that period. Her geography of the ancient world is a little odd. So she, for example, include Thrace as part of Greece, and yes, there was a colony there, but things were not the same. The stock that lived there previously was still in the majority, as far as I understand, and were not Grecians. But yeah, she's constantly on the search for some kind of clue in this, looking into the Asian steppes, and in fact, all the way into China, to try to find examples of where the movement was. And this is the kind of thing, there's no sort of overarching, and I think this is good, there's no overarching, this is how I envision it must have been. It's more an exploratory work, scratching the surface again of the scholarship, but reasonably, aiming for well-regarded people rather than looking at the fringes necessarily. Although she does touch on some of the fringes, some of the ultra-feminist writers trying to look at it, and in fact looks at the history of the history of the history, as it were, in terms of like looking from 19th century onward, and these weird blips where, one thing was in fashion and then another thing as an explanation. Were there Amazons? Were there not? Was there any reality to the stories at all? And it was an interesting ride to read through it. It's not something I'm going to keep. Again, I figured, I only have so many books that I'm likely to reread, especially since my inflow of books, like games, seems to be about as high as my outflow in terms of play. Reading books is, I don't tend, basically my argument for keeping things is, well, can I bear to part with this? And the problem there is, as for the most part, if it's not something that I just thoroughly enjoy reading, the answer should be no, and I would say that would be reasonable, right? I wish I could treat my games that way, but there's no way I can. But instead, what I end up with is, well, if it's not science fiction or fantasy, it has a different scaling. It really has to be something that I'd want to reread or keep as a reference or something like that. If it is science fiction or fantasy, the barrier goes way down with the, it was okay, and therefore I will not mind rereading it. That's just the nature of how I look at things. So this is going to go off with a couple of others that I covered recently. Back to the libraries, they're piling up for it. Anyway, for whatever this is worth, I wanted to go into that. The next one will be a fantasy book, and actually ties into gaming in an interesting sort of way. Not so much my experience of gaming, but something I have that I don't know why I bought, but whatever. Anyway, onward and upward.